Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us again for this third webinar in this series. As you know, this Q&A series is drawn from our experiences with Australian office tenants and delves into the common problems our clients are encountering and the solutions that we've been able to provide. For those of you that have a retail focus, the principles remain the same. But I'll encourage you to look into our weekly retail Q&A series, which takes place every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Sydney time. For further details, look on our website, lpc.com.au. I trust everyone is keeping safe and well. I am, as you know, and as I mentioned last week, I feel like a teenager again. However, I have noticed there has been an unsettling reversal of my teenage years, as I now find myself yelling at my parents for going out. Anyway, my name is Michael Raymond. I am head of LPC's industrial team, and I'm also your host today. My role today is to introduce the panel and the speakers for this week and the questions that they'll be answering. And then towards the end, I'll manage the Q&A session. Although, as you know, if I get a good one, I may pop it in earlier. So just to keep the panel on their toes. Next slide, please, Neves. We've brought together a panel of expert tenant advisors and workplace specialists. Unfortunately, Ken can't be with us this week as he's got a prior commitment, but we still have Julian Cresa, one of our directors specialising in the office sector, Rebecca Pelling, once again, our Managing Director of Project Services, and me, just to make up the numbers. Julian will continue on from last week with the revolution of the lease arrangements during and post-COVID-19, and then we'll hear from Rebecca, who this week will introduce to you the no-touch workplace revolution. Next slide, please. The format for this series has been drawn from problems our clients are facing in relation to lease and workplace readiness during and post-COVID-19. It's based on our successful weekly Q&A webinars we've been running for almost 10 weeks now for our retail tenants. Each week we'll have a panel, and two of those panelists will speak to problems relating to the COVID-19 impacts on leases and the workplace and the solutions that we have developed. We'll endeavour to keep the presentation brief to around 20 minutes and to allow 10 minutes at the end for questions. So on the way through, if you have any questions that come to mind, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and I'll get through as many of those as I can. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Julian, who will speak to the first question today, the revolution of the lease arrangements during and post-COVID-19. Julian, next slide.
Sorry about that. Okay. Thanks, Michael. Oops. Okay, thanks, Michael. So I'll be talking about lease readiness. How do we get leases ready to meet the COVID-19 challenge? Lpc Cresa has been assisting tenants navigate COVID in 3 key areas: rent relief, dealing with the immediate impact of COVID-19, lease restructure and lease renewals, dealing with the readiness of leases post-COVID, and the portfolio optimisation where the tenant occupies multiple sites. If we go to the next slide, please. So the question, the revolution of lease arrangements during and post-COVID-19. I think the answer to this is really identifying what are the implications of COVID-19 and the risks associated with an underutilisation of space and similar incidents that may happen in the future. So once we understand what those problems are, then we can articulate and look at how we can mitigate those risks. And we can do this through the lease by looking at different clauses that effectively transfer some of that risk onto the landlord. And typically that's through implementing greater flexibility within the lease. This week I'll be looking at the contraction and termination rights in particular. Over the last few weeks we've looked at the pandemic clause and the backdated COVID-19 relief clause, and in future leases, future weeks, we'll be looking at rent and rent reviews, building performance and prohibited tenants. If we go to the next slide, please. So before I start, I just wanted to say that Lpc Cresa is determined to negotiate rent relief in response to COVID-19 and in accordance with a mandated code of conduct, and where that code doesn't apply, in line with the principles of that code, So today we're talking about contraction and termination. Typically we talk about contraction and expansion rights. However, the focus during COVID is looking at how we can mitigate costs and reduce our occupancy costs. So we thought it's appropriate to focus on contraction and early termination rights. So what is a contraction right and an early termination right? Well, a contraction right is a right within a lease that allows the tenant at their election to hand back to the landlord a portion of the total floor space occupied. It may be a half a floor, a full floor, or multiple floors, depending on the size of the tenant. The trigger points are typically at a future point in time after the initial term after a couple of years, typically around 3 or more years. An appropriate notice period for the triggering of such a right is between 6 to 12 months, depending on the amount of space being handed back. We push back in relation to penalty provisions, which deal with a payment for a penalty for breaking the lease. But we do agree with a pro rata repayment of any incentive received in the form of a fit-out contribution or an upfront rent-free period. In other words, an incentive that has been applied over the whole lease term, but has been taken up front. And then we need to, if we do trigger a clause, we need to look at make good obligations, if there are any in the lease. And where it's a part floor being handed back or contracted on, we need to look at subdivision works as well and who pays for those costs and possibly whether we actually undertake those works. A termination right is very similar to the contraction right. The only difference is it relates to the entire space. And as a result, it typically occurs later on in the lease and sometimes with a longer notice period required to exercise that right. So the question is, what problems does a contraction and early termination right solve? Well, the purpose of a contraction and termination right is to allow a tenant to contract its floor space during the lease term. Typically, this added flexibility allows a tenant to more easily commit to a lease, knowing that they can flex at a future point in time. And when you combine it with other clauses such as an expansion clause, it typically also allows the tenant to commit for a longer lease term. And this is one of the reasons why landlords are willing to provide these clauses in the leases. So in relation to COVID, why are these clauses relevant? So, and I think there's two opportunities here. One is where a tenant is looking to reduce its footprint or exit the lease as a result of COVID. They've obviously got the ability to exercise that right. What I will say is these clauses typically deal with a future point in time. As I mentioned, the notice period might not be for 6 to 12 months. And as a result, the effects or the savings are somewhat delayed to a later date, the termination date more specifically. If we look at the other aspect of these clauses and how in relation to COVID we can use them to obtain relief, is where a tenant doesn't want to contract. And we can use these clauses. They have the ability to leverage an outcome with a landlord. And the reason why they can is because there is a tangible value to the landlord for the tenant not exercising these rights, now or at a future point in time. As an example, Lpc Cresa has negotiated with landlords cash settlements in the form of rent-free periods in exchange for foregoing the future right of exercising these clauses. Other outcomes can be in relation to deferred outcomes, such as reducing or limiting a make good at lease end. But the motivation for the landlord is to reduce their vacancy at a future point, which has an impact on valuation, and therefore there is a willingness to negotiate an outcome. And the benefit of leveraging this is that the savings can actually be immediate as opposed to at the termination right. Now, the importance of these types of clauses in the post-COVID-19 world is that the lease provisions that favour tenants in the form of added flexibility will become more common. A typical contraction and termination right allows a tenant to contract or surrender at its discretion or at an agreed point in time. In relation to COVID, we anticipate that these clauses may also be triggered on the back of a pandemic, or a pandemic clause, which I spoke about earlier, or what we should be calling a utilisation clause, meaning that if there's another event in the future, we can harness these clauses to reduce our occupancy and have that flexibility. So that, in a nutshell, is the contraction and termination rights. I'll now hand over to Rebecca to talk about workplace readiness.
Hi. Thanks, Julian. So Lpc Cresa has been assisting tenants navigate COVID-19 in 3 key areas relating to the workplace, being people, place, protocols. Today, we are focusing on the question of what the no-touch workplace revolution is and how it applies to the COVID-19 scenario. Next slide, please. Revolutions are the great turning points of history. A revolution is a tumultuous and transformative event that attempts to change a nation, a region, or society. COVID-19 is revolutionising the world and could very well represent the ultimate test of resilience for businesses in every industry, including their boards, and it will continue to. Business leaders have had to deal with many challenges, including COVID-19's brutal impact on the economy, whilst trying to sustain operations with a remote and distributed workforce. As restrictions are now being lifted, business leaders are looking to the future and how they will be doing business for the long term, including how to transition their people back to the workplace, and are asking, how do we do this and do it safely? Next slide, please. There have been a number of recent building and workplace revolutions. The green building movement comes to mind, which has had a lasting impact on the way we design and occupy space. The Green Star rating system is a well-known one, revolutionising our workplaces over the last 10 years, where it is now the norm to go paperless, to have energy-efficient lighting, add plants, and buy from sustainable suppliers. COVID-19 is similarly going to revolutionise how we design and occupy space as safety becomes paramount. The technologies and protocols previously only adopted by a few will now become the norm in a no-touch workplace. If we can do it at pedestrian crossings, then we must be able to do it in our workplaces. It's arrived and it's here to stay. Next slide, please. The no-touch revolution can be applied to all stages of the journey, from commuting, accessing the building facilities, as well as the workplace. We see that landlords who want to distinguish their buildings from others will start to promote their no-touch credentials, as they were doing with the end-of-trip facilities and green credentials. Next slide, please. I'm now jumping ahead just due to time restraints, and I've extracted from one of our risk assessment checklists that we've developed for our clients. In it, we identified different controls, including no-touch solutions at varying cost points, everything from hand-free door opening to facial recognition controls. Next week, I'm going to delve into the more detail on these no-touch technologies and their applicability or not to the workplace. Back to you, Michael. Next slide.
I'll just unmute myself. Thanks, Rebecca.
Right.
Good to hear. Now, I've got a few questions. I think I'll start with Julian first. Look, we heard you talk about the contraction and termination rights and the utilisation as leverage for an outcome with the landlord. Are there other provisions in the lease that I could use, say, that I could use?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what we've got to realise is that the landlord has drivers just like the tenant does, and typically they're actually the opposite drivers. They want to drive rents up and increase their income, and we want to reduce our occupancy cost. But clauses in leases have implications for both parties, and especially clauses that provide the tenant with extra flexibility are typically at the cost of the landlord. So if we are prepared to negotiate on them and give some of those up. For example, another clause might be the expansion right at a fixed point in time. You know, the landlord, I'm sure, will be very keen to listen.
Okay, good. Thank you. I've got another one for you in a minute, Julian, but I'll chop and change a bit.
I gather this one's for me.
It is. I'm not going to ask myself a question. Is a no-touch workplace really achievable, Rebecca?
Oops, I think.
Sorry, Michael, I just lost you then.
I said, is a no-touch workplace really achievable?
You might have to go to Julian because I can't hear you.
No?
I'm not sure. I think maybe repeat the question, Michael.
Is a no-touch workplace really achievable?
Maybe you can ask me a question.
Okay, we'll park that one for the moment. I've got one here that says, my landlord is saying the only way he will negotiate any rent reduction during this COVID period is if I sign along the lease. My lease ends in December 2020, and I'm not sure if I want to renew. Julian.
Yeah, I think that's that's a good point, and you can see the landlord's, you know, he wants to talk about an extension, but the question is, do we even want the space? And I think, you know, we often say the business decision needs to come first, and then the lease can follow. So if you're not looking to continue on, then you know, it's difficult to enter into a longer term lease. However, you know, it's things that you could, without trying to solution it, things that you could look at is, you know, for example, a 50% reduction in rent now and doubling the remaining lease term, so that, you know, you're giving the landlord further tenure, and your total occupancy might actually not go up. But, you know, it's about giving and receiving in many ways, and it's trying to get an outcome through, yeah.
So would you consider that good faith negotiations?
Not under the code, no.
Yeah.
I mean, under the code, I think it's important to deal with the current period and the period that COVID is affecting the business. Yeah. That's the good faith discussions. Now, the code also does provide for negotiated outcomes. So, but where there's a negotiated outcome that doesn't work for the tenant, well, there needs to be another outcome.
Sure. Look, I may stick with you for a tick, Julian, because it seems that Rebecca's having a little bit of trouble with her technology. But just another question: are we starting to see any movement in rates per square metre yet?
The answer is, it depends on the market. So, you know, if we look at Sydney, for example, the market, we're coming off a very low vacancy. So I think it's fair to say that it's come about very quickly. There's probably a little bit of holding out, as there is on the tenant side, but also the landlord side. They don't want to be dropping rates immediately. We are seeing the rates change though. So we are seeing that impact. And I think in other states, we are seeing the impact coming through more obviously. For example, Brisbane, where we're seeing incentives increase quite significantly, and I expect in New Zealand the same will apply. We haven't been able to occupy those workplaces.
Look, I'd have to share the same experiences as well, Julian, is in the industrial arena. Just with the number of transactions we're undertaking at the moment, it seems that landlords are looking at the incentive as being the means to bring down the effective rent rather than a face rent reduction.
Yeah.
It's a shame because there was a second part to that question, which is when will we have the new norm? That's really a question that's targeted at both of you, really, but more specifically Rebecca. So perhaps I'll just go down the list a bit more and see if I can find another one. Just bear with me.
Sure.
One to ask you, Julian. We've got a few. Here's a question. We can see benefit of such clauses as you're talking about earlier, I assume. Unfortunately, we don't have a contraction or a termination right within our lease, but would like to reduce our footprint. What do you consider to be important considerations for a landlord to consider outside the lease terms? Is it dependent on our lease expiry, which is in 2022? It's very similar to the earlier question.
It's very similar.
Yeah.
Look, it is about, I mean, in this case, I think the difference is that there's a willingness to stay on. So, you know, that is positive for the landlord. If we, again, it's sometimes market specific. If we look at Sydney, for example, we're anticipating vacancy rates to climb significantly in 2022, 2023. So if the landlord has that information, they'll be very keen to lock away a longer lease term. So you'll find that you'll be in a position to sit down and negotiate a contraction now in exchange for you know, extending the lease term. And I think what we need to be mindful of is when we say extending the lease term, we're extending the lease term having regard to COVID. We're not extending the lease term at a premium, you know, effectively repaying the savings that we're achieving now. So it is a commercial outcome to extend. It's not a repayment plan.
So I'll just test, can you hear me, Rebecca? The blank look on her face would suggest not.
Yeah, it looks like she's frozen there.
Yeah, that's a shame because there was a couple of questions for her. I think there are probably more questions for her, Julian, as well. So I think it's a shame. But, well, in the absence of any other further questions, I think we'll bring that to a close. I was just checking one last time to see if there's any further questions. No, sorry guys, I know you love answering the questions. So look, that brings our session to a close today. We trust you enjoyed it again and shed some light on what is a dynamic and complex situation. So thanks once again, Julian and Rebecca, although she couldn't hear us. But please, if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are on the next screen. If Niels could pop that up very quickly. Nevertheless, we'll move on. Look, please join us for the same time next week for our next webinar in this series. Next week, our experts will be tackling part 4 of the question, the revolution of lease arrangements post and during COVID-19. And Rebecca will continue with the no-touch workplace revolution, and hopefully she'll be able to hear our questions. Finally, all of today's attendees will receive an email with a link to the recording of this webinar. Please feel free to share that with your colleagues or anybody else you feel may be interested. So once again, thank you for joining us. Have a good afternoon. Stay safe, and we look forward to joining you again next week. Thanks very much. Take care.